And also, this is one of those types of lessons that we see some overlap between social studies. A lot of the RLA reading, we'll have a similar lesson in social studies. And you'll notice, some of the same sort of terms and things like that. So today for RLA reading, it's comparing and contrasting accounts. So the idea here is, looking at two different sources of information to find either similarities between them, find the differences between them, building on that idea, finding supporting details and main ideas, teasing those out of a text, and also things like tone and point of view. So different perspectives, which you'll see when we get into the lesson here. One person may have a different perspective on a similar or the same event. So that's largely what we're going to deal with today. So we'll go ahead and click in here to the lesson. And hopefully it loads for us. Here we go.
Hi there. Glad you can make it. Today, we're going to talk about comparing and contrasting accounts. This lesson will teach you to analyze multiple accounts of the same event or topic, noting important similarities and differences.
This also kind of will come into play. I've mentioned on multiple occasions the writing portion of the GED exam, the extended response. So being able to sort of analyze two different documents is going to be part of that, or two different opinions, two different perspectives. So sort of enhancing and strengthening our skill sets with that's really important as well.
Okay, first of all, what is an account? Well, an account is a first-hand report of something that happened. It's when someone tells a story about something that happened to them. I wrote a lot of accounts when I was a student teacher. That's how I shared my teaching experiences with my professor. Writing an account is one way to share a first-hand experience. Every once in a while, you'll see something called a fictionalized account. That's a story written to sound like a first-hand account. Fictionalized accounts are just another kind of account. Just be careful that you don't confuse fiction for fact when reading accounts. While we're on the subject, you might notice accounts described as first-hand, as in first-hand account. The term first-hand means something that is written from personal experience. Usually, first-hand accounts focus on the first-person perspective. So the author will say things like, I saw, or I ran, or I hid. A first-hand account is written by the person who had the experience. Fictionalized accounts are not first-hand accounts. They are fictional stories being told by an author. Here's a first-hand account from one of my fellow teachers. It's not exactly a great read, but it's a good example of an account. See how the text uses the first person I? The first person I suggests that this is a first-hand account. This is someone telling a story about their own experience. If the I referred to a fictional character, this would be a fictionalized account. So, you ready to dig into this? Let's get down to business.
And to add to that, so we're going to deal with different points of view in the literature side when we start talking about fiction, which we'll either get to this week. Yeah, we'll probably get to that this week. We're actually looking at pieces of fiction. Up to this point, we've looked at nonfiction, basically. And as you say there, so, a first person point of view is when you use those pronouns. You're talking about yourself, right? Use I, me. A third person is going to be, talking about someone else. So he, she, they, it, use those pronouns. Also, as far as when he says like a first-hand account, often that is a primary source, right? We talked about that as well. The document that occurs or set of documents closest to an event. That's the primary source. There's no document or there's no information in between that information and the event happening. A secondary source, like, is sort of like a second-hand account. The one kind of issue I have with the way they present this. Even as a firsthand account, you have to be careful, because if I'm recalling something that happened my senior year of high school, okay, well, yeah, I may have been there, but that was 30 years ago. So it's hard necessarily to call that a primary source if I'm recalling something that happened 30 years ago. Memoirs and autobiographies, people that are writing about something well past the time of it happening, our memories, that we're human, we tend to forget things, or we we manipulate our memories even though we might not be aware of it. So it's hard necessarily, even though it's a firsthand account, to necessarily continue to call that a primary source if it's so far removed from the event happening. But you still can call it a firsthand account. Okay, let's see what we got here. Scroll here. There we go.
Whenever you read an account, you want to start by describing the account. First, and most importantly, who is the author? Are you reading the personal account of a soldier? Or are you reading a story written by a doctor? Knowing about the author can give you a better understanding of the author's account. Next, don't forget to ask, where and when was the text written? Was it written in the trenches of World War I? Was it written in 1960s Brooklyn? Time and place gives you the context for the account, so you can fully understand what the author is saying. Last but not least, you need to ask yourself, who was this text written for? Is the account written to the author's parents? Is it a police report? An account's expected audience can have a huge impact on how the account is written. If I were to write a letter to my parents, it would probably sound very different than if I wrote a statement to the police. The audience wouldn't be the same. Let's see if you got this. Try describing an account.
That's something else I've mentioned along the way here. As far as active reading goes, you will get to the point where you kind of do this automatically. A lot of times we do this when I even thinking about it, when we're reading something. But yeah, of course, you want to understand who the author is, not just their name. And in certain circumstances, it might just not even be just their profession. If we were actually, really evaluating a source and we had the time to do so, we might look up that person and get more information about them. Where did they go to school? Did they have a mentor of some type? Have they, what industry did they work in? Other life events that could affect their way they think about something. There's a writer that works in military history and political science named Andrew Bacevich. And he wrote this really kind of damning book about American militarism. This is a guy that was an officer in, I think it served in Vietnam. He was a veteran, and really was wrote this warning about how our reverence for all things military in the U.S. is leading us down this really dangerous path. And really, just how it affects our foreign policy. Like, it's very, military first policy. We don't start with negotiations. We start with, firing at people and things like that. It's just, we look for the military first solutions now. What's really important to understand about that book and him is that he wrote that book about a year after his son died in Iraq. And that gives you better perspective of where he's coming from when somebody writes about something. Not that he's wrong at all. He's a credible author, and he makes really good points in this book. Why is he writing about that topic at that time? That certainly has influenced his thinking about militarism when his son, who was an officer as well, is killed in a war. And of course, where and when, that goes with historical context. And thinking about the events that are happening around it, 1960s Brooklyn or World War I trenches, also really important. And then, of course, who it was written for. A lot of times we have to sort of remove ourselves from that thinking because most of the time those things, particularly historical documents, were not necessarily written for us. A letter from a soldier in World War I was probably writing to a loved one back, home, or, maybe it was a battle report or something like that, but definitely did not think that somebody in 2022, in a history class or social studies class would be reading it. So that should be, something that we take into account when we read something as well.
Which answer best describes Meredith's account?
So looking here at Meredith's account, let's read through here, see what we see. So we got a little primer here. So this is Meredith and Paul Mendoza live in southwestern Bledsoe, just a few miles south of the interstate. Paul is an independent contractor. Meredith is an, human resources representative. This account is from the evening of August 15th, 2014. The story originally appeared in the August 2015 issue of the Bledsoe Herald as part of a retrospective. I think I got an asterisk beside that. Let's see what it says by retrospective. Do we have anything? Oh, it's fictionalized. So this is supposed to be, sort of just, for our purposes of learning, this is actually a fictionalized account, but it's supposed to be something that, looks like something that actually occurred. Of course, Bledsoe Herald certainly would have been a newspaper. So it was just after 6:30 when we got the alert. Paul, my husband, was outside covering the windows. Emma, our 11-year-old child, was watching TV. We'd been under tornado watch for most of the day. There were some strong winds earlier in the evening, but nothing too bad. That's when our phone all started making that awful sound, the tornado warning alert. First, it was Emma's going off, then mine, and finally Paul's. The alert said we had a tornado in the area. We knew we had minutes to get to shelter. We scrambled inside. I could hear a roar in the distance then, like some kind of giant hidden locomotive. Before I went inside, I spared a glance to the north in the direction of the approaching tornado. On a clear day, looking eastward from our house, you can see all the way to the interstate. This was not a clear day. The sky was already black as night. Yet, strangely, everything was also eerily calm. The tire swing hung motionless from the oak. There wasn't even a breeze. I couldn't believe how still everything seemed. That's when I saw it in the distance. On the horizon, right close to the ground, I could see occasional flashes of green. I knew what that meant. The tornado was pulling up power lines by the interstate. That meant the tornado was about 5 miles away. If it was headed our way, I knew it would be here in just a few minutes. Paul said that he hoped it would peter out before it got to us, but I just kind of knew that we'd have no such luck. The basement was already set up for the season. We were about as ready as one family can expect to be for this kind of thing. We all three huddled together in one corner and waited. The sound grew to a deafening roar in minutes. The wind shrieked like you would not believe. My husband and I both threw our arms around Emma and closed our eyes. Emma was crying. I was crying. Even Paul was crying. My husband and I were no strangers to tornadoes, but you have to understand this was like nothing we'd ever seen or heard before. It was just awful. The worst of it was over in minutes. Thankfully, no one was hurt. Even so, we stayed holed up for the better part of an hour. None of us wanted to face what was left upstairs. We climbed out of our hole around 7:30 to find pouring rain where our roof used to be. The eastern wall was stripped to the frame. Most of our furniture was either ruined or missing. Our whole life was in splinters. Whatever remained was a soggy mess. At that point, I just prayed that our insurance covered all of the damages. Thankfully, it did. So tornadoes are no joke. Get them around here from time to time. So looking at our question here, so which answer best describes Meredith's account? So here it's Meredith's account of surviving a tornado written after the event for a local paper. Now, oddly enough, or maybe, fortunately, they tell us all that in the beginning before we would have to read the article. Right? We have, who Meredith is, and it says, it doesn't tell us what the account is about. That's the only thing that we really have to read for. But it says this is account for the eating of August 15th. The story originally appeared in the August 2015 issue of the Bledsoe Herald as part of a retrospective. So, we know it's her account of a, written after the event for a local paper. We know all that. The only thing that we really had to look for is what the story is about. It's about surviving a tornado. I always mention here too, right? We look at the titles of things, look at the additional information. Here it's pretty straightforward. We have Meredith's account, they titled it. But any information, whether it's inside the passage itself, or it's the title, or source, like a reference footnote or something like that, you want to make sure that you take it all into account. So our answer here, Meredith's account of surviving a tornado, written after the event for a local paper.
Great job. This is Meredith's account of how she and her family survived a tornado. She shared her account with the Bledsoe Herald. Meredith's audience is the readership of the newspaper.
Yeah, so you can kind of classify things like that as well. So something that's written for a newspaper is going to be for a general audience. It's going to be for people for that, neighborhood or that city or something like that. But it's for a broad, wide audience. I'm not putting it in, if it was like some type of journal for meteorologists, something like that, or, other types of things. So even though specific audience for a location, it's a wide general audience that would read it. So that's something else to take into account. All right, here we go.
So now you've learned to question accounts. You're ready to start comparing them. Comparing and contrasting means seeing how two things are the same or different. Whenever I compare two things, I prefer to use a Venn diagram. Are you familiar with Venn diagrams?
Yes, we are.
Here, I'll review how they work. A Venn diagram is two overlapping circles. Each circle represents one thing that you're comparing. Where the circles overlap is the comparison. Where the circles do not overlap is the contrast. There are a lot of things to compare and contrast, but today I'm only going to talk about topics. So a few years ago, I read a book about a lost hiker who was found and rescued. The book gave two sets of first-hand accounts. The first account was written from the hiker's perspective. The hiker told the story about how she survived until she was finally rescued. The second account was written by the rescuer leading the search team. The rescuer told the story of how his team found and rescued the hiker. The two stories describe the same event using different first-hand accounts. The left side of the Venn diagram would be talking about the hiker. The right side will be talking about the rescuer. I start with the points of contrast. On each side, I list topics that appear in that account only. That's the contrast. The hiker was concerned with survival, so her topics include finding food, water, warmth, and shelter. The rescuer, however, doesn't have to worry about surviving in the woods, so the topics addressed by his account were very different. The rescuer's topics were about the search for the hiker, covering ground, physical evidence, sightings, teamwork. These topics are points of contrast, what the two sides do not have in common. Now I need to work on comparisons, what the two sides do have in common. First, the two accounts share a setting, the woods. Second, both accounts talk about weather. The hiker worries about the weather because she has so little protection. She's alone in the wilderness. The rescuers are worried about the weather for the same reason. The rescuers don't want anything happening to the hiker. The weather also makes it harder for the rescuers to search for the hiker. A third point of comparison is time. The longer the hiker is lost, the more likely that something bad will happen to her. Both the hiker and her rescuers are racing against time. These topics are points of comparison, where the two sides have the same concerns. Despite their differences, the two accounts have a lot in common. Each account has a different set of priorities, but the same goal. Both the hiker and the rescue team want the hiker found and recovered. The two accounts, however, are very different in how they describe the problem. The Venn diagram shows you, at a glance, how these two accounts use the same or different topics. That's it, in a nutshell. Are you ready to give it a try? Let's
So
see if you can compare and contrast two accounts.
the Venn diagram is a great way to visualize these sort of ideas about comparing and contrasting. And I've mentioned too, if you could have more than two, you could be comparing and contrasting 3 or 4 different things. You can have whole bubbles set up there that overlap. If you're taking your exam, if you're taking the social studies test, you're probably not going to have time to sit there and okay, I'm going to draw a Venn diagram, and then I'm going to fill these two sides out, because you're at a time limit there. But you can kind of mentally make a Venn diagram as well. You might not be able to picture everything like this. One way to think about common ground between two stories is what type of key words do you see? In this case, something like woods, weather, and time. Maybe not those specific words, but now you can start thinking about, okay, is this idea similar to what appears in the other text? What are things that don't seem to match up? It's probably easier to find the common ground first, and that way you can kind of see what lies outside of those areas. So let's take a look here as an example for
Contrast these two accounts. Try making a Venn diagram on some scratch paper.
Okay, so first here, so this is Meredith's account again. We just looked at about the tornado. So the second one, take a look at. So this account is from Lynn Forrester, a small business owner who runs a local garage, was leaving the city when he became trapped on the interstate along with 17 other motorists. This is a transcript of a BVPR radio interview with Forrester on August 15th, 2014. So similarities here, they're both in the same tornado, right? They're experiencing the same weather. Lynn is not at home. He was a small business owner, was leaving the city. He was in his car. He was trapped on the road. It's also for a different account. So he is giving this sort of in person to like a radio station. So we have the format's different. We have somebody asking him questions and he's replying. Also something to take into account, something we'll deal with from time to time. You'll have some questions about that as far as information from different types of sources, which might be a lesson that we get to later on. So the interviewer asks, Mr. Forrester, tell us, were you in the process of evacuating when you were trapped on the interstate? And Forrester replies, evacuating? No, nothing like that. My ex-wife and I have shared custody of our son, so every other Friday I have to drive into Allen to pick him up. That's why I was on the interstate. I wasn't evacuating or anything. The interviewer says, so what was the first sign of trouble? He says it was around 6:15. We were approaching the Wayward Street exit when 4 cop cars blocked all of the lanes of traffic. A police officer got on the loudspeaker and told us to stay calm and to remain in our cars. She said a tornado was crossing the freeway. The interviewer says, we had reports that you were outside your vehicle. What happened? And Forrester says, yeah, not my smartest move. So I saw some kid in a yellow windbreaker leave one of the cars. I thought to myself, no respect for the law. I mean, the cops just finished telling us to stay inside of our cars. This kid was maybe 14. He had no business being out in this weather. Did you leave your car to rescue the boy? Yeah, that was the plan. I figured I'd tell him to get back in his car and that would be the end of it. I guess it didn't work out as planned. No, it didn't. So I got out and shouted to the kid. He saw me and started running. The boy started running. Yeah, he just took off running. I ran after him, but the rain was really coming down at this point. I couldn't see a thing. Every once in a while, I'd catch a glimpse of yellow and some headlights, but then I'd lose sight of him again. How did you get into trouble? Well, between the rain, wind, and chaos, I got seriously turned around. I couldn't seem to find my car. At some point, I got smacked in the face by something and went down hard. Did you lose consciousness? I guess I did. I remember flailing around on the ground, water rushing over me in sheets. I couldn't manage to get up. The last thing I remember were these green flashes of light and the loudest thunder I've ever heard. Wow, my ears are still ringing. After that, my memory is fuzzy. Where did you wake up? Well, luckily, one of the drivers, a woman named Anna, managed to drag me into the shelter of her car. She rescued me. I woke up with a raging headache and this nice bruise on my chin. I kind of like it, though. It makes me look tough. So thanks for talking with us today, Mr. Forrester. Yeah, no problem. Hey, remember to stop by Lynn's garage for all your car maintenance needs. So he gets a plug in there for his garage at the end. So contrasting the two, right? We're trying to find the differences between the two. And which answer then includes topics that only appear in Meredith's account. So parenthood, shelter, and readiness. So we do hear about parenthood in the other account because Lynn is talking about picking up his child because he has shared custody with his ex-wife. Parenthood, home, and shelter. We hear about parenthood. We don't really hear about home or shelter. Readiness, home, and warning. I think that's going to be where we want to go. Readiness, warning, and shelter. I guess we do hear about shelter because they're trying to keep people in their cars. So the only one that we basically have three topics that are in Meredith's account that's not in Lynn's are going to be readiness, home, and warning. Yeah. So let's take
Great job. The focus of the story was on Meredith's family home. Meredith's family basement was already set up for the season. The family was prepared. They also paid attention to the tornado warning. Lynn's account didn't even mention the tornado warning.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I guess the only warning he got was from the police. So not an official warning there, but one that came later. Yeah. So again, we can kind of see those ideas shaping there. And if we were to, read those side by side, we'd read the other Meredith's account a little bit earlier. But you'll also, if you're posed with questions like this, reading them side by side, you'll be able to get a better glance of the topics that, are either included in both or are missing. And as I mentioned, if you're sitting down for your test, you might not have time to actually draw Venn diagrams or sketch out anything, but you could make some quick notes as far as like, okay, this topic seems to be in both, and hit some major points there. So if you're posed with a question like this, you can, through process of elimination, see, okay, well, these are both in here, but these are not, and that will help as well sort of identify them. So as usual, Debbie, I usually give everybody about 15 minutes to work on their own on the Essential Ed lesson.
Now it's time to show that you've learned this concept.
There are typically about 8 questions at the end of a lesson. And so to sort of just avoid, you guys having homework and everything, I usually take about 15 minutes to let you guys work on your own. And then we'll come back and review the questions here, probably about 2:25. Of course, we're not going anywhere. I'm staying right here. I tend to just stop sharing my screen and pause the video.